Okay, so World War II begins not in Poland, this is often the way it's often taught, but it began with an accidental firefight in 1937 at the Marco Polo Bridge, which is a few miles south of the capital of China today, Beijing. Now, there'd been a lot of tension between the Japanese and the Chinese, which I'll talk about in summary form, but that's where we mark the beginning of World War II in 1937. Quick point. The U.S. does not even get involved in World War II until December 7th, 1941. Think about it. That's almost 1942, December 7th. So the U.S. is very, very slow in getting involved in World War II. Okay, let's go back to China. Now, by the time Tokyo surrendered in 1945, the internationally recognized government of China was the nationalist government of Chiang Kai-shek, who had ruled China since the 20s. But in defeating the Japanese, Chiang Kai-shek and the nationalists lost a lot of blood. They lost a lot of resources. And after the war, the Chinese communists, under the leadership of Mao Zedong, began a civil war that lasted for 4 years. So, just to get the chronology straight, World War II, 1937, 1945, the Japanese are defeated. Almost immediately after the Japanese defeat, the Chinese nationalist government, which was the internationally recognized government, begins a civil war with the Chinese communists. Actually, the communists begin the civil war. And in 1949, the communists defeat the nationalists and they drive them to Taiwan. And today, Taiwan is still a very sore point in international relations because it's not part of recognized China. It has a kind of quasi-independent status, but it's ruled by its own government. So just to repeat, so the nationalists really do 95% of the fighting against the Japanese, but they're so bled white by defeating the Japanese that the communists, who do very, very little fighting against the Japanese for reasons that Mida explains and I'll talk about, they're able to defeat the nationalists. The communists are able to defeat the nationalists in 4 years after World War II and end up the rulers of China. So you could argue that the big winner in China of World War II is the communist government. But I'll be talking about that. Mida talks about that in great detail. I just wanted to kind of throw that out there. One more time, it's the nationalist government of Chiang Kai-shek that does most of the fighting against the Japanese. The communist government is in north central China. It does very little fighting against the Japanese. What it does is it organizes, it mobilizes, and it's very strong in 1945, and it just takes them 4 years to defeat the nationalists. So that's why that's how the communists come to take power in 1949, and the nationalists have to flee to Taiwan. So before before 1930 or so, Mida talks about this in the part of the book I have you read. China was more a geographical expression rather than a country. What's he mean by that? Here's what he means. If you look at a map, let's say you look at a map in 1930, you see China. You think, oh, it's super organized. It's kind of like the United States. It wasn't super organized. China was deeply, deeply fractured. There were many, many competing nodes of power in China, even during World War II. You had the nationalists and the communists, but as I talked about in class, you had countless warlords that would control an area of China. These warlords had their own armies. They were beholden to no one. They kind of did their own thing, and so China was very, very fractured. Uh, Really, I guess you could argue until 1949 when the communists take over. So that's what Mida means when he says that China, before World War II, was a geographical expression rather than a country. It was such a fractured place with so many competing power centers that sometimes they're working together, sometimes they're fighting each other. Totally chaotic. And what happened is, and one of the big important aspects of World War II in creating modern China is that the fight against the Japanese and the memory about the fight against the Japanese created a national identity out of this country that had been more a geographical expression before World War II. So World War II, the upshot of World War II is China comes out the other side much more a country. Now there was one more civil war to go, the nationalists versus the communists. But what the World War II did was it set up the notion today as China as a nationalist country, as a country where folks think of themselves as part of the same unit, the same nation, the same society that you just did not have before World War II. So this is one of the really key legacies of World War II. The idea of creating a shared, the fight against the Japanese, the war of resistance, created a shared national identity. It really can't be overemphasized, the significance of that. And it's one of the reasons that I wanted to look at China during World War II. So, in short, World War II, it set the stage for the communist dictatorship that is in place today. It also created, it set the stage for the idea of a common nationalist identity in China, where what had been a fractured country with many nodes of power becomes more or less a unified country. I'm not saying there's dissent in China, obviously there is, but it's nothing compared to what it was before World War II. And one of the reasons that the Chinese government doesn't brook any protest, and again, I'm not being an apologist, but the violence and the factionalism of pre-World War II China, and actually it kept going until the communists took over in 49. It's kind of in their DNA to freak out about protest because, as I said before, it's not a pluralist society, but they're terrified of that this factionalism that existed in China would come back. Again, I'm not apologizing for it, but this is kind of just the way they see things. So the Japanese incursion, the invasion of China, did was essential in stoking Chinese nationalism. Now, the other thing about World War II is that by the end of the war in 1945, the Chinese state, China as a nation, had regained the sovereignty that it had lost, and I'm going to talk about this in the next series of podcasts, between 1842, the early 1840s, late 1830s, and 1945. China had lost much of its sovereignty. There were many competing powers that had gone into China, had actually sent their military into China, hadn't conquered China, but they had pretty much had their way in China, mostly because of trade. So China comes out of the war as one of the big four powers. It gets a seat at the table at the United Nations, for instance, which would have been unthinkable 15 years before. So World War II is it's the game changer of game changers in Chinese history. Just to repeat, I'm a big repeater. I just believe in that as a teacher. If it drives you crazy, I apologize. It's just the way I teach. World War II creates a society that's not pluralistic, that's not tolerant, especially political dissent. And Mida will talk about this a lot in the book. And it also creates a sense of unity among the Japanese people, the importance of which really cannot be overemphasized.